Good morning, church. Today, Pastor Peter Chin will preach the message from Luke 22, verses 14 to 24. I'm Mariana, and I will read in English.
I'm Javier, and I will read in Spanish. Hear the word of the Lord. Cuando llegó la hora, Jesús se sentó a la mesa junto con los apóstoles. Entonces les dijo, ¿cuánto he deseado comer esta Pascua con ustedes antes de mi muerte? Porque les digo que no volveré a comerla hasta que tenga su cumplimiento en el reino de Dios.
When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God.
Lo mismo hizo con la copa después. Tomó luego en sus manos una copa, dio gracias a Dios y dijo, tomen esto y repártanlo entre ustedes, porque les digo que ya no beberé más de este fruto de la vid hasta que venga el reino de Dios. Después tomó el pan, dio gracias a Dios, lo partió y se lo dio diciendo, este es mi cuerpo, entregado en favor de ustedes. Hagan esto en recuerdo de mí.
After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.
Lo mismo hizo con la copa después de haber cenado, diciendo, esta copa es la nueva alianza, confirmada con mi sangre, que va a ser derramada en favor de ustedes. Pero ahora, sobre la mesa y junto a mí, está la mano del que me traiciona. Es cierto que el Hijo del Hombre ha de recorrer el camino que le está señalado, pero ay de aquel que lo traiciona.
In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed, but woe to that man who betrays him.
Los discípulos comenzaron entonces a preguntarse unos a otros, ¿quién de ellos sería el traidor? Surgió también una disputa entre los apóstoles acerca de cuál de ellos era el más importante.
They began to question among themselves which of them it might be who would do this. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be greatest. This is the word of the Lord.
I did want to close up this series talking about Deeper Together, talking about one major barrier to relationship that we have. And I think if you've been tracking in this conversation up to this point, you probably have been thinking about this yourself. And that is this question that I think has come up in my mind throughout this entire season, and that's this. How do we go deeper together when we disagree with one another? Right? It's not easy to have a relationship with each other when you know you disagree. Maybe you guys have different opinions on something. Maybe this person, didn't say happy birthday to you, or whatever the case might be. It could be something small or personal, but when that kind of thing happens, there's kind of like a little distance gets shoved between people when there's a disagreement between people. And we all know that. We feel that with each other, no matter if it's a family relationship or a friendship or a work relationship. It's not easy to be in a relationship when you disagree. Unfortunately, that's not even the extent of it, because we can go a step further and say this. How do we go deeper together when we disagree with one another about really important issues? Because we're not talking about the Seahawks here or the Mariners or things like that. Even that, I've seen friendships break up, on things like sports and things like that. That's not what we're really talking about here. We're talking about issues that have real importance that we feel very strongly about. Issues like Trump versus Harris, Palestine and Israel, vaccines and masks. You remember that? You remember the impact that had on us? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, abortion, Black Lives Matter, gay marriage, and gender identity. Even as I say those words, you can kind of feel and sense the impact that it has upon our relationships. When you have a relationship with someone and you feel very strongly about one of those issues and that other person feels very strongly on the other side, there is just something that stands between you. It is difficult to feel the same way about that person when you feel very differently about an issue that is very close to your heart. And so that's another barrier that stands between us. And it's not even just ending there, because we can go even one step further and say this. How do we go deeper together when we disagree with one another about really important issues when our culture tells us just to walk away? It just tells us to walk away. There are always ways for us to deal with disagreements and when we don't get along with someone. But the dominant way that we're being told as a culture and as a society to do that right now is we're just told the best thing to do is just walk away. Walk away from that relationship. You can't fix it. The disagreements are too deep. The divisions are too profound. The only thing you can do in those situations, no matter how important that relationship was to you, just walk away from it. Walk away from that friendship. Walk away from that parent. Walk away from that community, because what else can you do in those situations? That's what we're being told as a society is the best way to deal with disagreements right now is just to walk away. And that's where all of us stand. Whether you're a young person or you're an old person, it's hard to be in a deep relationship with someone no matter what, but especially when you disagree about things that feel very deep. And when everything around us is telling, just walk away, forget that person, you don't need them. You're better off without them. And that's kind of the situation we find ourselves. We're supposed to be here together as the body of Christ when these things stand between us. And the question is, how do we stand in relationship with these major barriers in our way? I want to set our expectations honestly and just say, I'm not going to answer it today. If you thought that's what's going to happen, I want you to kind of revise your expectations. I am not going to answer that, really. What I want to do instead is I want to give us a reflection. And I want to give us a reflection on one important moment, and that's on the Last Supper. Because I think the Last Supper can guide us as we enter into this season where there might be a lot of conflict and might be a lot of disagreement. And what I want us to do is just reflect on the Last Supper. And I put up a few images here. And I want us to kind of ask the question of yourselves, what do you think the Last Supper was like? When you imagine yourself there, you imagine yourself in that moment at that table, what was the spirit and the tone that was kind of present in that moment? And I think for many of us, because we know who was present, because we know what was being said, oftentimes how I think about it, maybe coming to my Catholic background, I think about this as a very solemn and very beautiful moment. A very moving, kind of transformative moment where Jesus is laying his heart, his love out on the table, literally in that moment. And I think many of us imagine it in that way. This is a beautiful, profound, solemn moment. But what I want to argue today is that when you look at the Lord's Supper, you are looking at a group of people completely at odds with Jesus and one another. You're not looking at a moment where people are all getting along and they're sharing this very special meal, kind of arm in arm. You are looking at a group of people who for 24 hours straight have done nothing but argue with each other and divide against each other and even conspire against each other. And oftentimes we don't know that because I think the beauty of the Last Supper kind of eclipses everything else. But let's just kind of run through what the 24 hours looked like leading up to the Last Supper. One of the things that happened is that Jesus is anointed at Bethany, and it says this in Matthew 26. While Jesus was in Bethany in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, which he poured on his head as he was reclining at the table. When the disciples saw this, they were indignant. Indignant, that's a strong word in the Greek. It says, why this waste, they asked. This perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money given to the poor. This conversation here is about what this woman is doing. It feels controversial and weird for a woman to pour out $30,000 of perfume on a person in that moment. All of us would be a little put off by that moment. And they're arguing about it, and they're impassioned in this moment. This word indignant is kind of at odds. It's actually kind of it's a reference to an angle. Like when an arm is bent against itself, that's what that word means. They are not in agreement about this moment. This is an argument that takes place here. They're kind of raising their voices in this moment. And so that happens kind of in the day before the Last Supper. And just kind of imagine what this is like. They're arguing about what is going on. Is that right? Should we waste money like this? Shouldn't we give this to the poor? I could very much imagine us arguing in the same way about something like this. In fact, it's such a divisive moment. It's so impassioned that the very next moment in Scripture in Matthew 26 tells us this. Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. This is what takes place in the day before the Last Supper. He's so upset by what has taken place, by the waste of this money, he has kind of set himself against Jesus. And we kind of see that in moments where someone gets into argument with someone and you can almost see them turn against that person. They're like, I'm done. I'm no longer on this person's side. And they kind of shift away and they are forever set against that person. That's what's taking place in this moment. It's such a controversial conversation that Judas says, I cannot tolerate this. This guy has to go. I am now against him. I was his disciple, but now I think he needs to go. That's what this moment leading up to the Last Supper is like. And then it gets worse. Because when they actually sit at the table together, this is what Jesus says. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed, but woe to that man who betrays him. They began to question among themselves which of them it might be who would do this. That word question, again, is a very light translation. This is a disagreement. This is an argument. They are accusing one another. And at that table, they're sitting at a dinner table, and Jesus is saying, one of you is going to betray me. I got to say, that is not the most unifying thing that Jesus could possibly say at a dinner table. But he says, hey, it's going to be one of you. And naturally what they do is say, it's not me. Is it you? Because I know it's not me. Imagine if you're at a dinner table together and your parent or someone says, one of you stole $30,000 from me. You'd be like, ugh. Kind of accusing one another, defending each other, defending against one another. That's what this moment was like. And as if it couldn't get any worse, what we're told in the very next verse, verse 24 says this, and then a dispute among them arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. I don't know how it goes from one to the other, where it goes from like, hey, who's going to betray Jesus? And the very next verse is, hey, I'm the greatest. But that's what happens. That's literally what takes place from one argument to the other, where they're saying, I'm not betraying Jesus, you must be doing it. And they're saying, I'm the best disciple. It's just back to back. You know, like sometimes you sit down at a dinner conversation and one argument starts off and then it turns into a different argument where it's like, hey, you remember 10 years ago when you said this to me? I really resented it back then, right? This is what's going on. Can you just imagine? Actually, we can all imagine what that feels like, right? This feels a little too close to comfort. This is what's happening. It's exploding into these other things. And then we hear them say this. While they're all arguing, Peter declares, hey, even if all fall away, I will not. And then Jesus uses his prophetic voice to say this. Truly I tell you, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically. He argues with Jesus. He disagrees. He says, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others said the same. They're arguing with the prophet, with the same Jesus who they have seen raise the dead. They're like, no, you're wrong, and I'm right in this moment. And here we get a true sense of what the Last Supper was really like. It is not this calm, solemn, beautiful moment. The fact is, disciples were completely at odds at the Last Supper, on the verge of being divided and scattered. That's really what this moment was like. And I think maybe to give us an analogy, it's like you're sitting down for a Thanksgiving dinner with your friends and with your family, and all you have done up to that point is argue about politics and about past hurts and about things that have come up between you over the course of decades. That's what the Last Supper was really like. And sometimes we isolate all the disagreements. We think that's separated from it. No, it translated right into that moment. It was right in the middle of that Last Supper. They're arguing about who's going to betray Jesus, who is the greatest, and all these things. They're disagreeing with Jesus all the way to the point, as was read today, as Jesus breaks the bread, they are arguing about what is going to take place. And what happens afterwards is even worse, because they're going to abandon Jesus and be divided and scattered. That's really what the Last Supper was truly like. What's interesting, though, is when we fast forward just a few weeks after this time, and we fast forward to Acts chapter 1, because we hear a description again of these same exact people who we just heard bickering, disagreeing on every single level about a variety of issues. A few weeks later, this is the description that we're given in Acts chapter 1. Then the apostles returned to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives, a Sabbath day's walk from the city. When they arrived, they went upstairs to the room where they were staying. Those present were Peter, John, James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James son of Alphaeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas son of James. Not Judas Iscariot, it's a different Judas. They all joined together constantly in prayer, along with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brothers. What an interesting kind of transformation, right? Because the last thing, we just saw that for 24 hours, they are arguing constantly. They are bickering about every possible thing you could think about, and yet here we see a few weeks later, they're together. And more than just being together, they're in unity. They're in fellowship in this moment. And that begs the natural question, what the heck happened? What in the world happened between this leading up to the Last Supper? All of the disagreements, all the arguments, all of the bitterness that must have been taking place in that moment. And then the division, the crucifixion. And then here they are a few weeks later, and they are together praying, worshiping God. What in the world happened? Well, I'll tell you one thing that didn't happen during that time, and that's this. Their disagreements were not solved through debate or argument, or one person proving they were right over another. There was no convention. There was no debate that took place. They didn't resolve or win over one another. There was no ideological resolution. They didn't come together. Later on, they would do that, actually. Paul would drop the mic on Peter. They would have the Council of Jerusalem. They would do that at times. But that's not what happens here. There is no Council of Jerusalem that takes place in between Luke 22 and Acts chapter 1. There is no mic drop moment where Peter says, hey, you were wrong, I was right, and this is the reason why, and writes an ancient Facebook post kind of like nailing this guy to the wall. Nothing like that takes place. There is no ideological debate or philosophical kind of one-upping each other that results in this. They don't resolve this stuff. And they don't win or figure out who is really right. So what happens between one point and the other? I think if we know kind of what is taking place in this moment, we know intuitively what happens between these two moments. What took place between these two moments is the resurrection of Jesus. That's the one thing that happens. The one thing that happens between this arguing, this division, this biting at one another, this trying to one-up one another, and this place of unity and prayer and fellowship is not that they resolve and not that they understand all the issues, that Jesus just rises again. That's really the only thing, and the ascension of Jesus. But that's all that takes place here. There is no intellectual or ideological resolution. There is only the resurrection. What that means is this. The disagreements between the disciples were not eliminated. Instead, they stood in light of all that Jesus had accomplished. Let me just give you an example that's maybe particular to the Pacific Northwest. People here talk about the big one. Do we all know what the big one is? It's that big earthquake that's supposed to happen, and really shake things up. And I think they released that report like the month before I moved out here, so that was not very encouraging, I want to say. But supposedly there's some big earthquake that's going to take place here, right? Now let's imagine that I'm arguing with Caleb about something big, something huge, something that really feels very, very deep. right? Something that feels like, I don't know if I can be friends with this guy anymore. And you can just imagine it, the person next to you, like, you believe that? You voted for them? Whatever, phrase you want to put in there. And the next moment it hits. 9 on the Richter scale. Something that we've never felt before. The entire world shaking in that moment. In the second after that moment, when the earth is shaking, and you realize something much bigger than anything you've ever experienced has happened, what happens to that disagreement? Do you go right back to it and say, Caleb, okay, let's talk again? Most likely, you'd be saying, what just happened? Are you okay? We're still alive. Oh my gosh, we're still alive in this moment. I got to call these people. I got to call thy loved ones. Go call. You need my cell phone to call your parents? Here it is. There's something profound when something transformative takes place. It has a way of not resolving the disagreements. I don't agree any more than I did before with Caleb, but something has happened nonetheless that has made everything overshadowed, that has transformed that disagreement nonetheless. And it's so strange. It's not an ideological unity that we share. It's not a philosophical one. Instead, that something has happened between us that overshadows what we thought divided us instead. And that's really the unity that the disciples had. They didn't have a political one. They didn't suddenly all join the same team. They weren't all pro-Roman or pro-Zealot at that point. They didn't all figure it out in those 40 days between the Last Supper and the ascension of Jesus. Instead, the unity that they had was a Jesus unity. It was a resurrection unity. It was this unity where they said, hey, we don't agree, but Jesus rose from the dead. That's got to mean something between us. And that's the unity the disciples shared with one another. I think we need to start building that into the church, rebuilding that into the church. And that's to understand this. Disagreements between believers will always happen, but they should be viewed in light of the work of Jesus and not separate from it. We are going to disagree. It's just inevitable. And it's biblical. Because even after this unity that they share with one another, the disciples really don't agree on very much when it comes down to it. Right? They disagree with James in terms of the importance of the Old Testament law. Peter and Paul would disagree about the Judaizers. Paul would disagree with just about everyone else as well, with Barnabas and with every person he's ever met. They are disagreeing all throughout that time. The fact is, that's going to happen. It's going to happen between us. But with the disciples, they disagreed, and Jesus was alive in their midst. Those two things coexisted with each other. And the resurrected Messiah shed light and perspective and provided a unity in the midst of those disagreements. You get what I'm saying? They didn't vanish. They didn't just get along suddenly. But everything they did was in light of the fact, Jesus is alive. I disagree profoundly with you, Peter, but Jesus is alive. What does that mean? What does that mean for that to be the case? We need to reclaim that for ourselves, because right now, what we are allowing, and I can feel this in my own heart, is we are allowing the issues to be the primary way that we see each other. You are on that side, I am on that side, and that's it. It's the only thing that defines us. You vote for that person, I vote for this person. That's it. That's our only point of connection. We have to realize as believers, that is not our only point of connection. It doesn't mean that these things are not real and important, but it means there is someone else who stands in the midst of that disagreement, and that is Jesus. Jesus is alive. He is resurrected. And he does shed light and transform those disagreements and provides perspective on them and a sense of unity. It's not ideological and it's not political. It is eternal in nature. And we need to reclaim that. We need to stop letting the world tell us how we're supposed to understand each other. It's forcing us to see each other in political ways. It's forcing us to see each other simply by how we vote or one issue or another. And we have to say, yes, that is one issue, but Jesus is still here amongst us. We need to allow the cross and the presence of Jesus to stand here and not to be eclipsed by the issues that surround us. I think there are 3 questions we can ask ourselves in this coming season, where there is a lot of pressure for us to push Jesus out of how we see one another. And one question we can ask each other is this: what does Christ have to say about this disagreement? What is Jesus' perspective on this disagreement? One thing I want to make very clear is that when I say all of this, I am not saying there is no right or wrong. I'm not saying that, oh, it's so postmodern. Who knows what the truth is? We're all right or wrong in some ways. No, some of us are wrong. I'm going to say it very honestly. And it's usually the people I don't agree with when it comes down to it. There is right or there is wrong. And so I don't want it to feel like I am just diluting the truth. And when we're all okay. Some of us are believing and doing wrong things. It is true. But how we figure that out is not from the media. And it's not from political pundits. It's from what Jesus tells us. It's the presence and the words of Christ. It's the ministry of Christ. And we need to bring that back and center the teaching of Jesus. When we're trying to figure out, hey, where is God when it comes to gay marriage? How do we understand abortion? How do we understand Black Lives Matter? The next thing we should be saying is, what does Jesus say? What does Jesus tell us? Because that's how we figure it out. It's not through this world, it's through Christ. That's one question we need to be telling ourselves. On the other side of that, we need to be saying, how does Jesus command me to view and treat this person that I disagree with? Yes, Jesus shed lights on the issue and the rightness and the wrongness of it, but on the same measure, he also sheds light on how we treat the people we disagree with. And I will tell you the truth, what Christians are known for, we are known for being ideologically right and personally very wrong. We kind of pride ourselves on being theologically correct and having the right thing to say, but treating people terribly as we say it. And there's a group of people that were so good at that in the Bible. And you know who that was? It was the Pharisees. We are coming behind the model of the Pharisees more and more when we do that. When we insist on ideological orthodoxy, but do not love our enemy. We can be ideologically dead on, center, and theological and all this different stuff and be so out of the heart of Christ. And we need to ask ourselves when we disagree, am I disagreeing in a way that this person can feel the love of Jesus through me? Do they sense the grace of Christ? Even as I disagree, that needs to be part of how we process this coming season. The third thing we can tell ourselves is this: how does Jesus' death and resurrection provide perspective on this disagreement? You know that list of issues that I talked about before, they are real. And they are hard. There are some real pain and real hurt. These are not just issues. These are people's stories. These are people's lives that we're talking about when we talk about these things. These are not to be minimized. Even at the same time, there's still perspective that we need, even when these issues come to pass. We need some sense of perspective in those moments. And one form of perspective that does not minimize the importance of these issues is to allow Jesus just to stand in the midst of them. Is to say, hey, as we talk about this issue that is so big to us, let's let Jesus be here in the midst of it. To give us a sense of perspective, eternal perspective, a sense of unity that maybe we couldn't manufacture for ourselves. As I think about how differently we think in this moment, Jesus is still here. That Jesus alone can give us a sense of perspective and a sense of relationship when nothing else can. That's another thing that we can do. But I do really want us to take this very seriously because we are entering into a tough season. I've been through 2 presidential elections in my 10 years here, and it has turned my hair grayer. It was already getting gray. I mean, there's something biological to it. But it was really hard. It was really hard. And the world got into me, and it got into so many of us, and it started to push the presence and the face of Jesus out of our conversations and how we saw each other. And what I want to encourage all of us, no matter where we lie on an issue, is to do the opposite. Let's bring Jesus back into the center. It doesn't mean that we'll figure things out. It doesn't mean that we don't have to have hard conversations. We do. But it means we will have these conversations in the presence of Jesus, remembering that Jesus is resurrected in the midst of us. We are going to disagree with one another. But when we do, let's view that disagreement and one another in light of the work and example of Jesus.